What happens when Hollywood royalty collides with actual royalty on live television? You won't believe what unfolds when Jennifer Hudson decides she's had enough of Meghan Markle's carefully crafted narrative and delivers a reality check that leaves the Duchess speechless. Last night's episode of The Jennifer Hudson Show turned into an absolute battlefield, with tensions exploding in ways no one saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses go head-to-head in what became the most talked-about interview disaster of the year. The atmosphere in Studio 6B was already electric before the cameras even started rolling. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated among the production crew about Meghan's extensive list of demands that had arrived just hours before taping. No questions about her relationship with the royal family, no mentions of her father, and absolutely no discussion of her failed Netflix projects. Jennifer Hudson, known for her no-nonsense approach and Oscar-winning authenticity, had reportedly raised her eyebrows when handed the restricted topics list. "Since when do guests dictate the conversation on my show?" she was overheard asking her producer, her voice carrying that unmistakable edge that anyone familiar with her work would recognize as a warning sign. As the show's iconic theme music began and Jennifer made her grand entrance to thunderous applause, there was something different in her demeanor. The usual warm smile seemed slightly strained, and those who know Jennifer well could detect the subtle tension in her shoulders. She greeted the audience with her characteristic charm, but keen observers noticed her eyes weren't sparkling with their usual genuine warmth. "Today, we have a very special guest," Jennifer announced, her voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested this interview might not go according to anyone's carefully laid plans. "Please welcome the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle." The applause was polite but noticeably less enthusiastic than usual, as Meghan glided onto the stage, perfectly coiffed and radiating the kind of calculated poise that had become her signature since entering the public eye. She was dressed impeccably in a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her jewelry catching the studio lights in a way that seemed almost deliberately blinding. But as she settled into the guest chair, something in the air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Jennifer's greeting was cordial enough, but there was a noticeable absence of the genuine warmth she typically showed her guests. "Meghan, thank you for being here," Jennifer began, her tone professional, but notably cooler than her usual style. "I have to say, it's interesting having someone on the show who comes with such specific guidelines about what we can and cannot discuss." The comment landed like a small bomb in the studio, and Meghan's perfectly practiced smile flickered for just a moment before snapping back into place. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was already brewing beneath the surface of what should have been standard celebrity pleasantries. "Well, Jennifer," Meghan responded, her voice maintaining that carefully modulated tone she'd perfected over years of public appearances, "I think it's important to set boundaries and focus on the positive work I'm doing, rather than dwelling on negativity." Her hands remained perfectly folded in her lap, but there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was already on the defensive, despite the interview having barely begun. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, a gesture that might have seemed casual to viewers, but was actually her assuming a more confrontational position. "Boundaries are important," she agreed, but there was something in the way she emphasized the word boundaries that made it sound almost mocking. "But I'm curious about this idea of negativity. When someone chooses to live their life in the public eye, make millions from telling their story, don't they have a responsibility to address all aspects of that story, not just the parts that paint them in the best light?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Meghan's composure showed its first real crack. Her smile became more forced, and she unconsciously straightened in her chair, a defensive posture that body language experts would later analyze frame by frame. "I think there's a difference between accountability and being asked to repeatedly justify your existence or defend yourself against false narratives. Meghan replied, her voice remaining level but with an edge creeping in that suggested her famous media training was being put to its ultimate test. False narratives, Jennifer repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. That's fascinating terminology, because from where I sit, it seems like every time someone asks you a direct question about your choices or actions, it becomes labeled as a false narrative or an attack. At what point do we acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, some of the criticism might be valid feedback rather than persecution? The studio audience was now completely silent, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. This was clearly not the softball interview Meghan had expected, and Jennifer was just getting started. Meghan's media team, visible in the wings, were frantically whispering among themselves, clearly unprepared for their client to face actual journalistic scrutiny, rather than the typical celebrity fluff piece they had negotiated for. Jennifer, I think you're mischaracterizing my position, Meghan said, her voice still controlled, but with steel creeping into her tone. I've been incredibly transparent about my experiences, even when it was painful to do so. I've shared my truth with the world, even knowing the backlash it would bring. The word truth was emphasized in a way that suggested she expected it to end the discussion, as if her version of events was beyond question or analysis. But Jennifer Hudson hadn't won an Oscar, Grammy, Emmy, and Tony by backing down from difficult conversations. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Meghan's with the intensity that had made her one of the most respected performers of her generation. Your truth, she said, the phrase dripping with skepticism. But what about the truth of the people you've hurt along the way? What about the staff members who've come forward with allegations? What about your family members who've been painted as villains in your story? Don't their truths matter too? Or is it only your perspective that counts? The air in the studio was now crackling with tension so intense that even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how Meghan would respond to this unprecedented challenge to her carefully constructed public persona. For the first time since sitting down, Meghan's mask completely slipped. Her eyes flashed with something raw and unfiltered before she caught herself, but it was too late. Jennifer had seen it, the audience had seen it, and millions of viewers would soon replay that moment over and over again. I find it incredibly disappointing, Meghan said, her voice now carrying a sharp edge that cut through her usually honeyed tones, that you would choose to platform harmful narratives and give credence to people who have been paid to tear me down. I came here expecting a certain level of professionalism. Jennifer's eyebrows shot up at the accusation, and a knowing smile played at the corners of her mouth. This was the reaction she'd been waiting for. The real Meghan, not the carefully orchestrated public persona. Professionalism? She repeated, her voice rising with genuine incredulity. You're talking to me about professionalism when you've spent years throwing your own family under the bus for profit? When you've made millions playing the victim while actual victims of real oppression watch you co-opt their struggles? The accusation hit like a thunderbolt, and Meghan's composure finally began to crumble visibly. Her hands, which had been perfectly folded, now gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were turning white. How dare you? She hissed, leaning forward with an aggression that shocked everyone present. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know the racism I've faced, the attacks on my character, the way I've been systematically destroyed by the British press and the institution I married into. Oh, I know plenty about facing racism and systematic destruction, Jennifer shot back, her voice now carrying the full weight of her own experiences and struggles. The difference is, I didn't marry into privilege and then spend years complaining about how hard that privilege was to handle. I didn't have the luxury of private jets and security details while crying about how tough my life was. And I certainly didn't throw the people who raised me under the bus the moment it became profitable to do so. The studio erupted in a collective gasp. Several audience members audibly whispered to each other, and the tension became so palpable that it felt like the room might explode. Meghan's face had gone from its usual carefully maintained composure to something approaching fury, her media training completely abandoned in the face of Jennifer's relentless assault on her narrative. "You're being deliberately obtuse." Meghan spat, all pretense of royal grace evaporating. "The situations aren't comparable. You weren't trapped in an institution that was actively trying to destroy you. You weren't silenced and stripped of your voice. You weren't dealing with suicidal thoughts while being told to just smile and wave." Her voice cracked slightly on the last phrase, but whether from genuine emotion or calculated manipulation was impossible to determine. Jennifer leaned back, her expression shifting from confrontational to something approaching disgust. "Trapped?" she said, the word dripping with disbelief. "You were trapped in one of the most privileged positions on earth, with access to resources most people can only dream of, and instead of using that platform to genuinely help people, you used it to build your brand. And when that became inconvenient, you walked away with a $100 million Netflix deal and a mansion in California. That's not being trapped, Meghan. That's being strategic." The accusation clearly struck a nerve, because Meghan's carefully constructed public persona completely shattered. She stood up abruptly, towering over Jennifer in her designer heels, her face flushed with anger. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," she declared, her voice now trembling with rage. "I sacrificed everything for love, and I've paid the price every single day since. I've been subjected to a level of scrutiny and hatred that would break most people." "Sacrificed everything?" Jennifer stood up as well, matching Meghan's energy with her own formidable presence. "You sacrificed a life of unimaginable privilege for an even more lucrative life of unimaginable privilege. You turned your pain into profit, your struggles into a brand, and your family relationships into content. That's not sacrifice. That's business strategy. And frankly, it's disgusting to watch you frame it as some noble gesture." The confrontation had now moved beyond verbal sparring into something approaching a full-scale battle, with both women standing and facing off like prizefighters in an arena. The audience was completely silent, mesmerized by the raw emotion and genuine animosity crackling between these two powerful women. Meghan's team in the wings were now frantically gesturing, clearly wanting to intervene, but unable to stop the train wreck unfolding in real time. "I don't have to listen to this," Meghan declared, her voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion for the first time in the interview. "I came here in good faith to talk about my work, my advocacy, my efforts to make the world a better place, and instead you've chosen to attack me personally, based on tabloid lies and racist narratives." Jennifer's eyes blazed with something approaching fury. "There it is," she said triumphantly. "The race card. Every single time someone challenges you on your behavior, on your choices, on the way you've treated people, you immediately cry racism. It's insulting to those of us who have actually faced real racism and overcome it without destroying everyone in our path." The accusation hit Meghan like a physical blow, and for a moment she seemed genuinely stunned into silence. When she finally found her voice, it was barely controlled rage. "How dare you minimize my experiences with racism? How dare you suggest that what I've endured isn't real or valid? You're supposed to be a black woman, supporting another black woman, and instead you're participating in my destruction." "I support black women who deserve support," Jennifer replied coldly. "I don't support manipulative people who use their identity as a weapon when they're called out on their behavior. There's a difference between facing racism and crying racism every time someone holds you accountable. And frankly, watching you appropriate the struggles of our community while living in unimaginable privilege is offensive." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and everyone in the studio knew that this confrontation had crossed a point of no return, heading toward something that would change both women's public personas forever. Meghan's face went through a series of emotions so quickly, It was like watching someone's entire psychological defense system collapse in real time. First came shock, then hurt, then a rage so pure and undiluted that it seemed to radiate from her like heat. "You know what?" she said, her voice now stripped of any pretense of media training or royal polish, revealing something raw and venomous underneath. "I should have known better than to expect solidarity from someone who's clearly jealous of everything I've accomplished." The accusation hit Jennifer like a slap, and her reaction was immediate and devastating. She threw back her head and laughed, a sound so genuine and dismissive that it seemed to physically wound Meghan. "Jealous?" Jennifer said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Jealous of what exactly? Your failed acting career? Your burned bridges with every family member who ever loved you? Your reputation as Hollywood's most difficult person to work with? Please, enlighten me about what exactly I should be envious of in your train wreck of a life." The brutal honesty of the response seemed to stagger Meghan, who took an actual step backward as if she'd been physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find words, clearly unprepared for someone to speak to her with such unvarnished truth. The audience was now leaning forward in their seats, completely captivated by the spectacular destruction of Meghan's carefully crafted image. "At least I had the courage to leave when I wasn't wanted," Meghan finally managed, her voice cracking with emotion. "At least I didn't stay and smile while they destroyed me from the inside. At least I chose love over duty, happiness over obligation. What have you chosen, Jennifer? What have you sacrificed for your principles?" Jennifer's expression shifted from amusement to something approaching pity, which seemed to infuriate Meghan even more than the laughter had. "I chose authenticity over manipulation," Jennifer said quietly, but her voice carried clearly through the silent studio. "I chose to build people up instead of tearing them down for profit. I chose to honor the people who raised me instead of destroying them for content. I chose to use my platform to actually help people, instead of just talking about helping people while living in a $40 million mansion." "You don't know anything about what I do for charity," Meghan shot back desperately, grasping for any defense of her public image. "I've donated millions. I've used my platform to highlight important causes. I've risked everything to speak truth to power." "Risked everything?" Jennifer's voice rose with incredulity. "You risked a life of unimaginable luxury for an even more luxurious life with better PR control. You turned your wedding into a global spectacle, your pregnancy into a media circus, and your mental health struggles into a Netflix special. Nothing you've done has been about service or sacrifice. It's all been about building the brand of Meghan Markle, and frankly, it's been painful to watch." The devastation of this assessment was written across Meghan's face, and for a moment she seemed genuinely vulnerable, stripped of all her defenses. But instead of acknowledging any truth in Jennifer's words, she doubled down with desperate fury. "I don't have to stand here and be attacked by someone who's clearly been fed lies by the same people who've been trying to destroy me for years. This interview is over." She turned to walk off the stage, but Jennifer wasn't finished. "Running away again?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the studio. "That seems to be your signature move. When things get difficult, when people start asking real questions, when accountability comes knocking, you disappear and blame everyone else for the mess you leave behind." Meghan spun around, her face contorted with rage. "I'm not running away from anything. I'm refusing to participate in my own destruction by someone who's obviously been compromised by the very forces that have been targeting me from day one. This whole thing was a setup." "A setup?" Jennifer stood up straighter, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned every success through talent and hard work. "The only thing that was set up here was your expectation that you could control the narrative like you always do. You came here thinking you'd get another softball interview where you could play victim and sell your story. Instead, you met someone who actually cares enough about truth to ask real questions." The accusation seemed to break something fundamental in Meghan's composure. She turned to her team in the wings and made a sharp gesture. Within seconds, 3 members of her entourage rushed onto the stage, surrounding her like a protective shield. "We're leaving," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This interview is terminated." But Jennifer wasn't about to let her have the last word. "Of course you're leaving," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the commotion. "Because staying would require you to actually answer questions about your behavior instead of just deflecting and playing victim. It would require you to take responsibility for the pain you've caused, instead of just monetizing it." As Meghan's team began escorting her toward the exit, she turned back one final time, her composure completely shattered. "You'll regret this," she said, pointing directly at Jennifer. "When the truth comes out about who orchestrated this ambush, when people see how I've been treated here, you'll regret every word you've said." Jennifer smiled, an expression of complete confidence and satisfaction. "The only thing I'll regret is that it took this long for someone to finally tell you the truth to your face. Good luck with your next victim narrative, Meghan. I'm sure it'll be very profitable." The final insult was too much for Meghan to bear. She yanked free from her handlers and took several steps back toward Jennifer, her face flushed with absolute fury. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who I am? Do you understand what I've accomplished?" "I know exactly who you are," Jennifer replied with devastating calm. "You're someone who confused marrying into importance with actually being important. You're someone who mistake privilege for persecution and attention for love. And most sadly, you're someone who had every opportunity to do genuine good in the world and chose personal profit instead." The words hit their target with surgical precision, and Meghan seemed to physically deflate. Without another word, she turned and stormed toward the exit, her team scrambling to keep up with her rapid pace. As she reached the studio door, she paused for one final moment and looked back at Jennifer with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," she called out, her voice echoing through the stunned silence of the studio. Jennifer remained standing center stage, completely composed and radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had spoken truth to power and emerged victorious. "Yes, it is," she replied simply, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the studio. "For you, it's been over for a long time. You just finally figured it out." The studio door slammed shut behind Meghan and her entourage, leaving Jennifer alone on stage, with a studio full of shell-shocked audience members and crew. The silence stretched for several long seconds before Jennifer turned to the cameras with a slight smile. "Well," she said, her voice returning to its usual warm tone, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. "That's what happens when authenticity meets manipulation on live television." We'll be right back after these messages. As the cameras cut away and the studio erupted in stunned chatter, everyone present knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented in television history. Jennifer Hudson had done what no interviewer had managed before. She had completely dismantled Meghan Markle's carefully constructed public persona and exposed the calculating opportunist underneath. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate through the entertainment industry for years to come.